basic question they ask us is, why is it justified to wait? And I think the answer is very simple to everyone who has lived in a country where war actually happened. The idea that war in itself is an intrinsic evil, the idea in itself, Mr. Speaker, that when people are fighting and you have no escape, not because your state doesn't want to protect you, but even the people who are trying to protect you are the very same people who could be killing you. There are a number of things I want to talk about to the previous speaker. Firstly, they say that there are no trends by which we can say that there are actual changes going on. I want to give you 3 trends. This happened only recently in 2011. Firstly, we think there was a rebirth of free market capitalism when in Syria they reopened things such as casinos, multinational corporations and such. Second, in 2011 there was also the end of the 48-year state of emergency, which is something we would consider a massive development as far as the rights of the government are concerned. We think they've lowered a lot of barriers of the people on the ground as far as democracy is concerned, and they've lowered a lot of power struggle and power structure in their state. But thirdly, we would say even religious freedoms have now been on the rise in Syria. The idea that Syria has now rehired a lot of school teachers who were previously dismissed, for example, for wearing face veils, and we think that these trends give us an idea that concessions have existed, and we think that the fact that they do exist means that leaders are willing to change, and we think them to make absolute statements by which we think their arguments have been based on are not acceptable. But second, they talk about this idea that their policy will work because the only thing we need to do is take away high-profile leaders and everything will be okay from there. First of all, we really have to question again, and this was a POI I asked, to which we think there was no valid response. Who are the countries that are going to fight this war, and how successful will they be really? Because the military might that they're talking about is the military might of the United States, NATO, EU, maybe even Russia and China, all countries which we think have no vested interest to fight now, but in fact have an interest to veto the particular UN Security Council move to actually allow these wars to begin with. So, what did they say? Turkey has an army. Turkey has 11,800 soldiers, Mr. Speaker. We don't think they have any form of legitimate capacity to do what they did in Libya, for example. We think this is not winning the war by raising countries which have no might in the first place. Next, they say that defectors are going to happen anyway. What we would want to say is that as far as Syria is concerned, we think that there's a lot of rhetoric on the ground, whether it came from the government or people on the ground of an anti-international community one. The idea that they are anti-United States. So, assuming the United States was the one who supported your war, we think they're not going to be okay with that. But assuming the United States is not the one going to be participating in that war, how are they going to win? And we think the wreck of that war is not going to win them any form. But lastly, this idea of refugees, right? They say, well, what they're going to happen is this idea that there's going to be less refugees, and this was a massive assertion. We would say that logically speaking, when you participate in a war, that gives people a massive, great incentive to run away, Mr. Speaker. We think that when violence is less or gradual or something, Mr. Speaker, that can be prevented by not participating in a rally, we think the incentive for people to run away is going to be much bigger. When wars happen in cities, and even if you didn't want to participate, even if you didn't want to be there, strikes fear in the hearts of people, that is when people are going to run. But what do they say? Turkey has an expressed incentive to accept these refugees. If this is true, even under our policy, we think that apparently there is an asylum for these people and we think there will be no problem. Last rebuttal. They told us that what their policy will do is that because the military might is there, Russia, China, and Iran will back off. This first of all assumes that the might is going to be stronger than Russia, China, and Iran all combined, which think there are very few countries, either Turkey nor Qatar, have that might. But more importantly, who would want to antagonize these countries to begin with? Like the idea why we want a UN Security Council vote is the idea that we need to respect the notion that many countries are not willing to fight against superpowers like this. When Russia, China, and Iran are not okay with this idea, you have to give us a number of countries who are willing to face these countries even after this war goes on. No, please be seated. What am I going to talk about? What we want to say, Mr. Speaker, is the value of the UN approval. And we think that the UN approval gives us a very good message of an idea that post-construction will indeed happen. Firstly, what we want to compare, and I think that this is the meat of the debate to which we think they have not engaged in, is the difference of the interest of a UN and the difference of the interest of individual nations or coalitions of the willing. What is the calculus of coalitions or individual nations? There are 2 questions we want to ask. Firstly, which ones will participate? Which ones have invested natural interest to make sure, for example, that wars in these particular areas are not going to go larger and things like that? What they told us is the issue of refugees. This means that the number of countries that we can really factor in as people who are interested are people who are nearby. And like they said, Turkey and Qatar. We question, what is the incentive of Turkey to participate when they don't want, for example, to send a message of the idea that they want to involve themselves in so many regional issues, given the idea that they want to now participate in the European Union and so on and so forth. As far as Qatar is concerned, we think their military might isn't even strong. As far as the NATO is concerned, we think if you look at Libya, the Libya case study, what we can see is that they didn't even have the might to send soldiers because they didn't have the money, because of the European Union crisis and so on and so forth. But the second question we need to ask is, how far will they go? How far will the coalition of the willing go as far as rebuilding this entire nation is concerned, when their only concern is to remove the regional threat? What we would say, Mr. Speaker, to this particular idea is that when there is no more harm to their own nation, they're okay with leaving this particular nation behind. This is ultimately harmful, Mr. Speaker, because even if you can depose the leader, if you have no guarantee that people will invest in making sure the country will have an established government, we think the long-term harm is going to be even so much greater. But let's ask ourselves the calculus of the United Nations. When we ask all countries what their interest will be and whether they're willing to participate, we think that there are a number of ideologies behind it. The idea of rights, Mr. Speaker, the idea that we have a totalitarian perspective to see that we're meshing not only military might to depose leaders, but diplomatic, political, and socio-economic incentives to make sure that these countries re-establish themselves in the long run. If we look at examples like Myanmar, for example, we think that there have been a lot of changes in Myanmar that did not necessarily need military might. And why is this so? We think, Mr. Speaker, that if you look at it, the trends in Myanmar can be credited to the idea that very few countries have tried to meddle in this issue. The ASEAN, for example, is non-interventionist. The less we pressure these leaders to use military might, the less these leaders will need to use might to scare people away. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we think they still have not given us a group of countries which could reasonably win this war, and for all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose it.